Hello and welcome. It's day 2 of the Weapons and Society conference. And today we have 2 papers on collecting and documenting arms and armour. My name is Hugh Wilmot. I'm chairing this session. I'm a senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Sheffield. So I'm hoping to learn lots of fascinating things today. And as I said, we got 2 papers. The first paper is going to be a dual presentation, so hopefully that'll go nice and smoothly, by Chris Young and Phil Philo, and they're going to be talking about a sword used by Cromwell and other arms and armour in the Spence Collection, Preston Park Museum, Stockton upon Tees. Now, Chris Young is the exhibition officer at Preston Park Museum in the Tees Valley. His work has been mainly dedicated and specialised in the arms and armour of the Spence Collection. So that's the topic of today's talk, I suspect. He has training in firearms at the Royal Armouries and in Japanese swords from the British Museum. So not somebody to cross, really. Currently, he's working with Phil Philo, recataloguing the arms and armour, and I suspect that's what we're going to be hearing about. Phil is a retired senior museum curator who's worked in local and social history museums. He's a member of the trustee of the Battlefields Trust, operating co-chairman in the Northern Borders region until his recent move to Derbyshire in December 2020. I think that suffices as a brief introduction because I don't want to cut into their time, but they're going to spend the next 30 minutes telling us about the arms and armour in the Spence Collection, Preston Park Museum, and I'll look forward to receiving questions which I can put to them at the end of our 2 papers. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, folks. I'll just quickly bring up the presentation. It's decided to disappear from me, so I'll just reopen that. Two seconds. These technical hitches. It's just reopening now. Here we go. Share screen. There it is. That's it. I think we are pretty much ready to start. So, hello. Welcome to this talk on Spence's Arms and Armour. My name is Chris Young, and I'm the exhibition officer, as we've been discussing there at Preston Park Museum and Grounds. And together with my colleague Phil Philo, the retired senior museum curator, we've had the opportunity to research this fantastic individual that is Spence and his collection. Hopefully today you'll get a better understanding of why this chap is so important and why the collection is one of the gems in the region. Some of the information on Spence himself is written by Spence, so I get him to do part of the talk for me, which is quite good. So, who was Spence? We'll go over the vital information of who he is now. So, Gilbert Morad Spence, he was born in 1879 and he died in 1925 in Stockton, comes from the local area. His family kind of dispersed from the northwest. They were all working in shipping, and then he moved over to the Teesside area. Well, his father moved and worked on the east bank of the River Tees. On the west bank of the River Tees, the family that lived at Preston Park Museum, which was Preston Hall, were called the Rottners, and they worked in kind of competition and collaboration. Spence himself, before we get into his real interests and career, he was also in the civic kind of profession. He was the youngest mayor of Thornaby. He was interested in people. He tried to help them in both the working profession and in their civic lives. And his mother, who's quite interesting, her name was Elizabeth Dorothea Spence, and she was very involved as well in generosity and campaigns and trying to help with the troops during the First World War. Now, the Rottners and the Spences were both very invested in the local battalion. It was the volunteer battalion Durham Light Infantry, and then it evolved into the 5th Durham Light Infantry. And they actually attacked my museum. They attacked the hall in 1904. There was one division for defense, one division for attack, and then Spence was the referee. And this is the actual slide, which kind of shows you the news report on the day. And basically, they concluded that with tea cakes and some sports, and it was a mock attack. That's probably worth mentioning at this point. That it was one of these training campaigns that they carried out. Now, 10 years later, and war breaks out, and the Spence family again are very engaged in this. Spence was not only invested in the DLI in terms of this time, and he was at one time a captain, but by 1914 he was the colonel of the 5th Durham Light Infantry. Well, his mother, who wasn't a very well woman, she was actually traveling because she would go to spa towns to try and feel and get a bit better. Well, she was in Austria right when war broke out, caught behind enemy lines. She'd actually been writing and corresponding accidentally with a German spy, a chap called Paul Ederhardt, and we have their correspondence. She wanted to get health insurance for a servant. And then at that point, also stashed in the Spence archive is the letter that he was shot in Belgium. And she used cigarettes and diplomatic measures and means to try and get out. And she did successfully get to Paris and then headed up to Thornaby. And you can see the documentation here. Paul Ederhardt saying that basically there are no German spies. They're all British. All the ones in Britain are just detective agencies and things like that. And you can see the telegram, which is highlighting how she's getting out of Austria. So the 5th DLI didn't engage in the First World War until 1915. They were actually in test trenches and preparing in 1914. 15, they engage in the Second Battle of Ypres, and they come through Le Havre, and they really have a baptism of fire. 1916 rolls round, and obviously Spence is in command at this point, and they're fighting in sectors from south to north, and they're renaming trenches as they go. So on the Somme, we have the trench maps. We have a Spence trench, and one of the members of the Western Front Society actually went out and had a look at that. There's a Durham trench from the Durham DLI. There's a Rutherford trench, which was one of the officers, and his father was the estate manager for Highclere Castle, which is Downton Abbey. And they, I believe, actually gave land in Wales to help the troops do some testing and some mock attacks. So yeah, quite an interesting history with how Spence went about. And the privates that were in his battalion would write their own diary entries of a man who would march up and down the lines, telling his men to dig in while ignoring shell fire, to give you an idea of who Spence was. And he won the DSO during the Somme. Now, Spence was a conscientious man, and this is where we're going to start actually talking about his collection. And basically, this is a little touch on it. He actually painted over 100 watercolors during the campaign of basically men generally at rest, not so much at the war, or usually a memorial. So here you've got a couple of them that are quite poignant. You've got Butte de Wallencourt, which he painted, and obviously that was something that they were fighting towards in the Battle of the Somme. It was an ancient burial mound, but the Germans had used it for entrenchment. They had it covered in barbed wire and machine gun, enfilading the troops as they came through. I think the Fusiliers kicked them off, but then they got kicked off again, and then the Germans retired to the Hindenburg Line. And the king actually came to the Butte de Wallencourt because it was one of these areas of real severe fighting, and Spence painted that. He painted Conte, where he travelled to, which he was actually training after the Battle of the Somme. And Spence's last battle was in 1918. It was the Battle of Esters. It was a town where the Germans were having one last roll of the dice, and they pushed into Esters very quickly. It was block by block fighting, similar to the Second World War, grenades, machine gun fire. The DLI took over from the Portuguese. They sadly lost Esters. They pulled out. They had a crescent formation around a river. The next day, the Germans were completely drunk from nicking all the alcohol from the cellars. This is in the DLI's official records, written by Rames. They come out with steel shields to try and protect themselves as they come over the bridges. They were not paying attention to one of the bridges, and two of the privates actually tried to recapture the bridge on their own, which they did for a short amount of time. And then Spence was shot in the leg, and he was out of the war. The Battle of Arn, which came after that, sadly knocked the whole of the 5th DLI out of the war as well. It was a hell of a war. Spence, though, like I was saying, was painting his war effort. This is where we get into the collection. He also painted his collection. Conscientious man, military collector, and he was basically wanting to capture this collection in the same way he was capturing his war effort. He did pen and ink sketches, he did watercolors and paintings of snuff boxes in his war collection. Now, the way that his collection seemed to be focused, if you can see in this slide here, is towards the 17th century, dated to 1612 or 1617. I think the partisan is there. And basically, that seems to be because of a couple of reasons. And one of them is he had a subscription to a magazine called The Connoisseur, and it seemed to be the magazine for military men and where to get their taste for collecting. Also kind of set out baronial halls and things like that. Also, Spence, in his crazy collecting activities, he was injured in 1915 in a gas attack, and he collected in between battles when he came back to do some recruitment. And we've even got within his archive all the lists and receipts. And here we've got 2nd of August 1915. He's still collecting swords, he's still collecting armor, he's still collecting snuff boxes and powder flasks. And Spence himself, there's a little extra story there that we'll touch on towards the end, but he really was still collecting during the First World War. Now, Spence was also collecting not only because he was interested in it because of his tastes, he was also collecting because he was a real philosopher, a real thinker when it came to wartime activity. And yeah, so basically we've got this amazing collection of his archive. And within that, we have his own thoughts and feelings on what is war, why were weapons like evolving and changing. And we've got examples in the Spence weaponry collection that match up to this philosophy, these ideas that he had. Now, he wasn't a warmonger. He didn't believe that war was brilliant or like it was a great war. He felt that war was necessary to protect the innocent, that peace at any price shouldn't be happening. He would not have been for appeasement. He died in 1925, sadly, in an accident driving over a bridge. But I think if he'd have been around for the 1930s, he'd have been a strong voice to intervention when necessary to prevent larger scale war. But moving on to when he talks about war, his next section in his book, which is not published and I am transcribing, hopefully one day to publish, he collected all sorts of elements that went from Stone Age right up until 1925. So as you can see Spence's own writings here, and you can see examples of his collection that match. So we've got Stone Age prehistoric items, he has flint axes. We've got Bronze Age items, he's got Airwork Park swords, which we used in a recent study by a chap called Raphael Herman. It's a fantastic paper on Bronze Age weaponry. Iron and Middle Ages, he has those examples, and Middle Ages to modern and steel. And that's where Phil will be able to pick up on that very nicely, because we'll move now into looking at the specific pieces of the collection.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. And thanks, Chris, also for asking me to share this presentation with you. As Senior Curator Museums at Middlesbrough Museum Service, we participated in a project with partners Tees Archaeology and the Battlefields Trust in a project called River Tees Rediscovered, a partnership initiative from 2015 to 19 organised by Groundwork. And the purpose of that project was to reassess the River Tees during the conflicts of the mid-17th century, the Bishops' Wars and the British Civil Wars. And that resulted in a publication. As a result of that, when I finished working at the Museum Service in 2017, I was invited by Preston Park Museum to help with the creation of a temporary exhibition at the museum to mark the 375th anniversary of the Battle of Yarm, a royalist victory on the 1st of February 1643. And these two images show little corners of that temporary exhibition. It was staged in 2018. Following this, and in pursuit of a personal interest in arms and armour of the Civil Wars, I must emphasise I'm not an arms and armour specialist. I worked with Chris to carry out a review and recataloguing of the 16th and 17th century collections held in the Spence Collection at Preston Park Museum, which for me involved voluntary work 1 day a week over the last 3 to 4 years. This included looking at items on permanent display, such as these items in the Stockton Castle showcase in Preston Park Museum, but primarily the large number of items in storage in the reserve collections. The first group of objects that we looked at were those most familiar to me and also similar to those appropriately featured in the Museum Service's probably most famous, probably one of the most important exhibits, This is French artist Georges de la Tour's painting, The Dice Players, created about 1650, which includes mid-17th century soldiers wearing an assortment of armour. This was the collection including helmets, breastplates, backplates, arm and leg defences. Although this is not a large collection, it does include that used in the 16th and 17th centuries, a period heavily represented by Spence's collecting activities, such as this gorget, breastplate, and cabossette, similar to the ones in the de la Tour painting. Spence's first recorded acquisition, 2 German fencing swords in 1905, was followed by a number of sword and rapier purchases over the following 4 years. His first recorded armour purchase came in 1910, and that was a pikeman's helmet purchased from the dealer Armstrong for £1 10 shillings, or £1.50. Chris has already mentioned, by this time, Spence's collecting activities seem to have been influenced by features in popular magazines like The Connoisseur, and the display of his collection reflects photographs of displays of private collections in that magazine. You can see here on the left an image from The Connoisseur showing Arthur Radford's collection, and on the right, one corner of Spence's home, Elmwood in Hartburn in Stockton, showing his extensive collection on display in his home. Here's another one on the left-hand side of Elmwood, of a fireplace with a pikeman's armour displayed above it. And recently in Preston Park Museum, there has been a reconstruction of this display with the very pikeman's armour seen here displayed above it. Recently, Preston Park Museum has been a partner in a major research project and has had pieces of arms and armour featured in the exhibition Sold, the Great British Antiques Story exhibition, which was staged at the Bowes Museum between January and May 2019. You can see on the right-hand side there some pieces of the armour, including a German black and white armour seen here. As I say, I'm not an arms and armour specialist. We're always looking for support and information and a review of what we've carried out so far. And this black and white armour has a painted V Prengeli on the inside of the breastplate, which you can see here on the right hand side. If anybody's got any information or thoughts about what that means, then we'd be very pleased to hear from you. The armour collection generally includes everything from cuirassier close helmets of the late 16th, early 17th century, like the one seen here, and several examples of the more common harquebusier's armour of the mid-17th century, including breastplates and backplates, and both continental Zishaga and triple bar lobster tail pot helmets. I'm going to leave the armour behind. Probably the collection of edge weapons is of most interest, especially the rapier, broad and back swords, daggers and knives, pole arms, early bayonets, ranging from broadswords of the 16th century, like the one seen here, to small swords of the 18th century, and even some military patterns of the 19th century. There's a collection of some 20 rapiers, and these have been recatalogued and classified according to AVB Norman's classic work, The Rapier and Small Sword. And we found that 2 of the collection were considered to be significant by Norman and are featured in that work. But the rest had never been reassessed according to Norman's work. So that's something we did. And as you'll see here from the next few slides, everything's classified now according to Norman hilt types. And the collection includes both military swords with various hilts, various blades, and civilian types also. One rapier in particular, which gives this presentation its title, A Sword Used by Oliver Cromwell, is said to have been, and I quote here from Spence's albums and notebooks here, preserved in the family of Major Hunby of Farnham, Dorset. It was purchased through Hemsworth Ripon and Armstrong in July 1912 from a sale at Knaresborough near Harrogate, North Yorkshire. This is the rapier here. This weapon is currently the subject of analysis by Chris and I, and we are, of course, aware of the very tenuous connections between even those broad and back swords, rather than rapiers, which have supposedly long-standing associations with Cromwell. So more on that, hopefully later. That's one of the pieces we're going to be working on in some detail. Of course, Cromwell and edge weapons, he's more usually associated with back and broadswords, and the collection has a number of examples of these weapons. This is a really nice one here, usually with mortuary and basket type hilts. And we've got about 12 examples of this type in the collection, from very early examples. This one's of particular interest. It has local connections. This is a basket hilted sword, according to Spence, found rusty in a ploughed field near Stokesley, Yorkshire, and had been in the property of the parson there. And Spence bought it through the dealer Armstrong for £2. Again, we've reclassified this according to the standard work on basket hilts, Mazansky, as we have with all the other basket and other type hilts. Here's another nice example here. You can see the decoration on the hilt of a mounted man here and other figuring. One of particular interest is a Mazansky mortuary hilt type with a blade marked Hound May Facket, made at the Hounslow Sword Mill, Labour-Bridge Bedfont on Hounslow Heath. You can see the marks on the blade at the top right-hand corner there. There are other variants, including this broadsword, usually associated with Hounslow blades as well, with a brass lion's head pommel, and another one fitted to a hanger blade with a so-called mortuary, so-called Hounslow type hilt of the mid-17th century. Moving on from the swords and rapiers, the collection also includes pole arms. There's a photograph here from one of Spence's photograph albums here. Partisans, spontoons, spears, and here are some in the flesh, ranging from a bill of about 1500 on the left-hand side through to a later second half of the 17th century, probably partisan there. Not part of the current assessment are the extensive collection of daggers and knives seen on the left here. There's a good collection of Scottish basket hilt swords, mainly of the early 18th century, and a fantastic collection, 20 or 30 early plug and socket bayonets, which really do warrant a viewing by somebody who knows what they're about. It's a very fine collection. And I finish off here, making the bridge between the armour, the edge weapons, with this engraving on the lock of a wheel-lock rifle, showing edge weapons in use, a pikeman with his drawn sword and his pike, fending off a horseman with his back or broadsword. And I hand over to Chris to give you an idea of the firearm collection.
Thank you very much, Phil. So yeah, with looking at what we've got here with the firearms, it's quite nice in that how we've kind of framed this, in that the writings of Spence as well, picking some of those back up with some of the weapons we're looking at. His writings do kind of transition through the elements that Phil was talking about, the armor, the pikes, the swords, and then we move into the last part of his writings on the firearms. With that, to start out with, we've obviously seen that lovely edge piece, and then we'll come back to that. But one of the first things he writes about is the fact that the early weapons came obviously in around like the 1500s. Also, they were not just pistols and firearms and a musket. You also got things like mortars and cannon. In his collection, though, he has a very nice early piece, probably from around the 1500s. I did a little bit of research with the Royal Armouries to try and find out some background on it. Potentially Eurasian, I think we had that down as. But again, Spence wanted a piece that would have been early, and here it is in his collection. It's similar to a picture you see as you come into the Royal Armouries. I think there's a nice photo of it on the right-hand side as you come in, a very similar piece to what he has there. Moving through, he starts talking about matchlocks, again, as weaponry evolved. Got lovely pieces there as well. So we have one here, which is more for hunting than there is for actual warfare. It's inlaid with ivory and pearl. It has a lovely brass lock plate and brass barrel. It's actually within the ivory shield. You can see the date on it, 1627. We've got another one with a mystery barrel mark, which I'll come back to again sometime, maybe in the Q&A. Then we've got the wheel locks, and we've got wheel lock rifles. We don't just have wheel lock pistols. This is the one that obviously Phil's used very nicely to kind of transition through. And each of the pieces themselves, where Spence was collecting, were quite ornate, artisanal pieces. Obviously, these were things for warfare and killing, but they were also used by experts, used by hunters, used by people who want to produce nice kind of ceremonial pieces. And yeah, this piece here, obviously, we've got that lovely etching on the actual wheel lock itself. And this kind of comes nicely to, he collected just locks himself. This one's quite fun because some of the etchings he has actually have very nice artistry, but similar to some modern artistry in a TV show called Adventure Time. And we put that out on social media, and everybody went crazy about it because it was as if the artist hadn't died and it'd been 400 years, he'd been sneakily putting out weaponry alongside cartoons and TV shows. We've got, obviously, because we've been doing recataloguing, the opportunity to talk to other organizations and museums. So we have a pair of Electrocount pistols, and we were able to talk to the name right, I apologize, Dresden Armory, which is the Rustkammer, and they were able to come back and basically tell us that the Electrocount pistols that we had, we thought they were belonging to one part of the royal family, they belonged to another part of the royal family. We were able to update our records, we're going to be able to tell better stories because of that. And then we've been working on updating those records with that. This is obviously a pair of Electrocount pistols from 1610. A piece that I've been working on with Phil very recently, and we put out a journal article in the Journal of Arms and Armour Society, is the French King's gun. Now, this has been something that we've been putting a little bit of work into, and has been an exciting find for the museum, in that we were doing a valuation exercise. We kind of challenged a little bit and said, look, can we get a better look at some of the weaponry? A chap called Thomas Delamare came up, he had a look at the pistols, he turned one over, and it happened to have the 214 etched on the bottom, which is the 214th entry in the cabinet of arms of the French Kings of Bourbon. And we were like, fantastic, what an amazing find. We didn't even have that recorded down. I set to work doing a journal article on that. And it came up with a brilliant couple of things. So obviously, it's in the collection at Preston Park Museum. It was owned by Spence. Before that, it was owned by a guy called T.K. North, who was the managing director of the Vickers plant, the factory there. They invented, and he had a hand in the Vickers Vimy bomber, which was the plane that flew up with Alcock and Brown, flew over the Atlantic and did the first Atlantic crossing. Anyway, T.K. North's great uncle was a general in the Battle of Waterloo. And it seems that there was two times when weapons left the cabinet of arms. It seemed to be the Battle of Waterloo, maybe with trophy giving, and in 1830 when the French were revolting. And I think because of this great uncle, perhaps it was 1815. And then obviously before that, it was in the cabinet of arms, goes back to Louis XIV, Louis XIII, and potentially Henry VI of France. So I've been able to track it from Spence all the way through to hopefully Henry VI or Louis XIII, because he was the gun king. So this is a lovely piece for that. Another element of the story which comes out, and I've made a claim in the journal article, is the inscription, Vis est ardienter inventus, or the fire that burns inwardly is the more to be feared. Its pair, because it was taken away from its other pair, has a different inscription. That's the right hand of Jupiter fires thunderbolts. So I make a claim in the journal article that this potentially is one of the earliest examples of a left-handed gun, because if fired from the left hand, the flash in the pan would burn across you. So the fire that would burn inwardly. Obviously, that's just a little bit of a theory, but I thought with the right hand of Jupiter and the fire that burns inwardly, perhaps that was a little play on words. Maybe it's the kind of thing that Louis XIII would have quite enjoyed. And so we've been able to present that in the article. We've also got another nice pair of pistols, which are made by Barber. They were owned by the Duke of Argyll, who was the general of the combined British Armed Forces. If you've ever seen the movie Rob Roy, he's the guy who kind of backed Rob Roy in that movie. Just so happens that Spence thought some of his family were from Scotland, and he had an inclination to collect those kind of pieces. And then starting to wrap this up with a bow now, basically what we've got is collection of powder flasks to go with all the firearms. This is a very nice piece, again collected in 1915, between the time he was in combat and he was at rest, doing a bit of recruitment. This came up on a television show we did for the Antiques Road Trip. And also there was one extra piece that we discussed, and it's a Zweihander, which in our archive in Spence's own ledger inventory was collected in 1917. And this Zweihander, obviously a German sword, two-handed sword, was collected when Spence was fighting in the Kojal Valley. So he was fighting Germans while collecting German swords, potentially by telegram. So quite a crazy thing, and highlighting what kind of collector Spence was. And that kind of brings us to the last slide we have here, that Spence, being conscientious, very into his collection, and wanting also, because he was quite an artistic man, wanting to paint it, he also painted some of his collection in contemporary setting. And here, this kind of really brings it all together. He was painting his armor, his muskets, his rapiers, small swords, his powder flasks, all together in a scene which matches to his collection. So that really ties all that up in terms of how he would collect and how he would bring that together in his mind and in his own collections. And then with myself and Phil, we're working on several other publications, obviously looking towards the Cromwell sword. I'm working on the transcript of his writings. And then Phil himself, he has a publication coming up for English Civil War.
Yeah, I'm very much wanting to get something out on the Tees Valley, significance of the Tees Valley during the Bishops' War and the Civil War. And that would be a fantastic opportunity to put the Spence collection, elements of the Spence collection from that period into such a publication. I hope Chris doesn't mind me also saying that the work we're doing really needs to be looked at by someone, specialists in the field of arms and armour, to verify or not the work we've been doing. And we very much welcome somebody coming to have a look at the collection with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'll just remind people, if they have questions, can they put them into the question and answer box, and we'll come to them after the second presentation. And probably just to save my confusion, if you're going to put a question on our first talk, once the second talk is going, can you say who the question is directed to, just so I don't put the wrong question to the wrong person. But thank you very much. So actually, if Stuart, you start sharing your presentation while I introduce you. Our next speaker is Stuart Fose, and he is a postgraduate researcher in the first year of a collaborative PhD jointly supervised by the University of Leeds and the Royal Armouries. His research explores the ethical issues surrounding the facilitation of access to museum collections that are restricted by law. Investigating the procedures implemented by the registrar team at the Royal Armouries that underpin public engagement with its collections of arms and armour. And today he's going to talk about the compilation and collation of a large amount of work done by others in the past, documenting weapon collections at the Tower Armouries. So I'll hand over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you for Chris and Phil as well for the really interesting presentation to start the panel off. So hello everyone, and thank you for attending. This presentation has grown out of the preliminary investigations for my PhD that Hugh just so kindly introduced, the ethics of accessing museum collections that are restricted by law, specifically the arms and armour collections of the Royal Armouries. Initially, I plan to take a long-term perspective of the development of collections management practices at the Armouries since the 19th century. My research focus has subsequently changed, but the earlier history of the museum at the Tower of London has continued to intrigue me. One subject to which I've regularly returned is the enduring institutional legacy of Charles Fawkes, whose work at the Tower Armouries during the early 20th century constitutes the primary focus of this talk, and indeed whose words I co-opted for its title. Through his 1916 work, The Inventory and Survey of the Armouries of the Tower of London, I'm going to explore the principles and processes that shape the documentation of weapons at this early 20th century museum. First, a little about the man himself. So Charles Fawkes was a key figure in the field of arms and armour during the first half of the 20th century. Originally, he was an artist with links to the arts and crafts movement, but during the 1900s, he turned his attention specifically to metalworking, so the fabrication of arms and armour as well. His studies soon attracted the interest of Viscount Dillon, the first curator of the Tower Armouries, who soon designated Fawkes as his successor. Taking up the post in January 1913, Fawkes directed the armouries uninterruptedly for 25 years until his retirement in 1938. He oversaw the institution's transformation into a more recognisably professional museum. The entirety of the White Tower was given over to exhibitions, acquisition strategies were systematised, and dedicated stores were set aside for surplus collections. Not content with these considerable duties, Fawkes also helped institute the Imperial War Museum in 1917 and occupied the positions of curator and secretary there until 1933. Outside of his official postings, Fawkes regularly wrote books and articles on various aspects of arms and armour. One of his most enduring contributions combined his institutional responsibilities and his scholarly interests, namely the inventory and survey of the armouries of the Tower of London. Fawkes produced this work at a key moment in the armoury's history. In April 1916, the White Tower was opened to the public following a major redisplay of its collections, which for the first time occupied the entirety of this historic space. The inventory and survey encapsulated much of the investigative groundwork that underpinned this ambitious logistical endeavour. Over 2 volumes, Fawkes systematically documented the collections of the Tower Armouries, recording what he deemed as the key characteristics of all the objects it then held. This makes the inventory and survey a unique record in the institution's history, as it appears to constitute the only full and unabridged catalogue of its collections published in modern times. While it was primarily given over to this exhaustive inventory of the Armoury's holdings, the work did also serve other functions. Much of the first volume related a comprehensive biography of the Armouries, for instance, tracing the development of its collections, buildings, and institutions against the turbulent backdrop of British history. It even included an extensive bibliography to enable further study into the institution's colourful past, if its 2 sizable volumes somehow proved inadequate for readers. Given its incredible scope, this work provides an invaluable insight into both the historical precedents and innovatory practices shaping the Armoury's operations during the early 20th century. So the catalogue that dominates the inventory and survey was heavily indebted to early 20th century documentation frameworks that were being developed at the Tower Armouries. The catalogue's arrangement mirrors the organisational divisions of the collections themselves, as listed here in the 1914 column. This was the result of Fawkes's first significant achievement as curator, his major overhaul of the institution's classificatory system. A series of unique identificatory codes for individual objects was a relatively recent innovation at the Armouries, dating from the mid-19th century. This labelling system used Roman numerals to denote a class of objects, so for example, crossbows, firearms, etc., and then an Arabic numeral to distinguish each item belonging to that category. However, these numbers weren't fixed initially, and their frequent revision made keeping track of individual weapons difficult. The accession numbers recorded in the inventory and survey, however, were exceptional in that they became permanent. By inaugurating a documentation framework predicated on unique and distinguishable records, Fawkes ensured that the use, condition, and knowledge of a particular weapon could be recorded over time and always associated with it thereafter. In short, the foundations of a modern collections management system. Within each class, all of the relevant objects are recorded in numerical order of their accession number. Following the conventions of the collections catalogue format, descriptions of every object adhere to the same basic template. Each entry thus contains the following information where available: its accession number, name, date, physical description, references in academic literature, physical dimensions, maker's mark, and historical provenance. This choice of categories reveals much about how folks perceived and thereby framed the armoury's weapons collections. Physical and historical attributes feature prominently, while any discussion of their actual use is conspicuously absent. An object-derived documentation framework does have its drawbacks as well, such as accentuating disparities in coverage between individual weapons. King Henry's breech-loading arquebus, as you can see in the picture on the left, is the subject of a lengthy paragraph due to its royal pedigree. In contrast, many other entries only comprise an object succession number and title. It would be unfair to solely blame Fuchs for this inconsistency, as it was as much the result of the haphazard survival of information about the collections over the years. Yes, he could have undertaken further research in an attempt to rectify these omissions, but this would have been a Herculean labour given the size of the collection, and there was no guarantee that the relevant information had ever been recorded anyway. So despite these limitations, the classificatory framework that structured the inventory and survey ultimately fulfilled its basic purpose: the rational organisation of the objects and associated information that constituted the Tower Armouries collections. Although divided into innumerable sections, chapters, and individual entries on account of its taxonomic structure, a number of common themes run throughout the inventory and survey. One of the most evident is Fuchs's systematic efforts to thoroughly historicise the Armouries collections, discernible at both a structural level and that of individual records. When considered from this perspective, prefacing the catalogue with an extended history of the institution made perfect sense. Recounting the Armouries' past development from a working armoury to a national collection accentuated the unbroken historical lineage of its weapons collections, central to appreciating their significance in Fuchs's view. This historical focus was further strengthened by the individual catalogue entries, which emphasised the weapons date in bold text alongside its title, and regularly included extended accounts of these objects' provenance. References to the unique heritage of the Armouries collections are thus ubiquitous in the inventory and survey, suffusing it with a distinctly historical character. Fuchs's historical presentation of the Armouries collections was closely bound up with his views on authenticity. His treatment of fakes in the inventory and survey is particularly illuminating in this regard. He dismissed the modern forgeries that comprise Class 21 with barely disguised contempt, stating that as none of these items have any historical value, they have not been included in the present volume. This provocative stance wouldn't have aroused much comment in Fuchs's day. The dominant Rankian view was that history should objectively replicate how things actually were. It therefore followed that any later reproductions that didn't fit this narrative, weapons or otherwise, could be unceremoniously discarded. It's perhaps not surprising, though, that Fuchs took such an uncompromising stance towards the collections at the Tower Armouries. He had the unenviable task of rectifying countless errors about the collections, which he attributed to the lax supervision of earlier custodians who'd wrongly prioritised spectacle over intellectual rigour. Under Fuchs's management, it was clear that the weapons collections at the Armouries would be subject, therefore, to the dictates of historical authenticity. Fuchs's compilation of such a large volume of information about the Armouries collections in his quest for accuracy had ramifications that even he may not have originally foreseen. Weapons could constitute important examples of material evidence in of themselves, which could be studied to reveal new insights in fields beyond the direct study of arms and armour. One field of study regularly represented in the inventory and survey was the history of industrial development. Like with Henry VIII's arquebus, details of manufacturing and reproductions of makers' marks were attached to individual weapons entries where available. Fuchs then assembled this information together at the end of the catalogue in its appendices in the form of tables of makers' marks and an index of armourers. These records may now seem modest to modern readers as they lack any dedicated analysis, but it's nevertheless possible to see in them the first steps towards more sophisticated studies of manufacturing innovation. The same two-pronged approach is also apparent when considering the formation of the Armouries collections within larger matrices of acquisition and transaction. Again, individual entries relate to the provenance of specific weapons, whether from previous tower inventories, gifts from various benefactors, or purchases at prominent sales. One of the appendices was then devoted to listing all of the gifts and purchases that had bolstered the Armoury's holdings since the early 19th century in chronological order. By acknowledging the diverse origins and continual evolution of the institution's collections, Fawkes could be seen as prefiguring the modern interest in the development of international markets and exchange mechanisms for material culture. So while the inventory and survey may have primarily been an examination of arms and armour, there were signs that Fawkes was aware of the possibilities of studying these artefacts to better understand developments in other fields of research. So thus far, I've largely presented the inventory and survey as an individual endeavour, an impression undoubtedly compounded by Fawkes' position as the Armoury's sole curator. As Fawkes himself acknowledges in this excerpt, however, the opposite was true. Given the work's ambitious scope, he required considerable assistance and subsequently recognised the various contributions of his many collaborators in the work's preface. After thanking those who'd aided in the survey's physical publication and the accompanying redisplay of the White Tower, Fawkes acknowledged his intellectual debts to a number of notable scholars. This brief list demonstrates that he cultivated many friends in high places. Sir Guy Lakin, keeper of the King's Armouries at Windsor, Charles Reed Peers, Inspector of Ancient Monuments, Reverend Edward Dorling, a heraldic expert, Edward Edwards of the British Museum, and Albert J. Coop of the V&A. Fawkes' ability to readily call upon the knowledge of these established experts highlights the tightly knit nature of networks dedicated to learned inquiry in early 20th century England. By far the most important contributor to the inventory and survey, however, was Viscount Harold Arthur Lee Dillon, Fawkes' predecessor as curator of the Tower Armouries, and pictured on the right, seated in the picture. Indeed, Fawkes perceived his own efforts as continuing his forebear's legacy. It was Dillon who'd originally initiated the rigorous investigations into the institution's collections from the 1890s that underpinned much of the information that was ultimately printed in the catalogue. As Dillon's protege, it's hardly surprising that Fawkes' attitudes towards the collection and his role as steward of them closely mirrored those of his mentor. For instance, Fawkes described Dillon's insistence on historical accuracy with great reverence, a trait Fawkes himself regularly demonstrated over the course of the inventory and survey, as we've already seen in his complete rejection of historical forgeries. Fawkes' professional and intellectual indebtedness to Dillon is perhaps best encapsulated by the handwritten dedication present in the front of the copy of the inventory and survey that Fawkes originally presented to Dillon on the 12th of July 1917, and which now resides in the Armoury's archives. It reads, "To my dear friend and master, Dillon, built upon his foundations." So far from being a lone curator then, it's clear that Fawkes readily drew on the expertise of his forebears and contemporaries to better understand the arms and armour collections under his charge. How did these scholarly investigations of weaponry translate to wider audiences? If the inventory and survey is at all representative, not particularly well, unfortunately. Fawkes' attitudes to the public ranged from scholarly paternalism to haughty disdain. His default mode of addressing the work's readers about the Armoury's collections can best be described as didactic. In the preface, for instance, he professed that he wished his study, and I quote, "to be of educational value and interest to the general public." This passage is revealing of Fawkes' intentions for the work's wider impact. Education was paramount, while any curiosity it generated in the study of weapons was welcome but secondary. In other places, however, he was even less sympathetic to his potential readership. At one stage, he even accused the uneducated public as being responsible for the perpetuation of absurd and misleading traditions at the Armouries. Here, Fawkes behaves as an exclusionary cultural gatekeeper par excellence. The public can benefit from exposure to the Armoury's collections, but only if these interactions are closely supervised supervised by qualified expert and enlightened experts like himself. The intellectual tone of the inventory and survey becomes even more apparent when contrasted with another contemporary publication, the Authorised Guide to the Tower of London, which is pictured here. First sold to visitors in 1886 and regularly revised thereafter, a new edition was released in 1916 to incorporate the newly completed redisplay of the White Tower. While the inventory and survey presented an exhaustive catalogue of the arms and armour held by the armouries, the guide traversed the highlights of these same collections through a narrativized literary tour of the tower's displays. This stark difference in composition exposes the distinct audiences intended for these two works. The inventory and survey catered to arms and armour enthusiasts with specific inquiries about the armoury's collections, whereas the one-penny guide was marketed towards the mass tourist market, who were assumed to be interested in arms and armour largely as mere objects of spectacle. So despite superficial nods towards wider public engagement, the inventory and survey was primarily a specialist work of scholarship that made few concessions to the uninitiated. So, having explored what Fawkes's inventory and survey reveals about the management and reception of weapons collections in the early 20th century, now seems an apt time to explore its more enduring legacies. Fawkes's innovations continue to shape the documentation of weapons at the armouries a century later. Indeed, his influence is still clearly discernible in its online collections database. The continuities become unmistakable when you compare the entries for an individual weapon in the inventory and survey and the digital database alongside one another. In this case, those of King Henry VIII's breech-loading arquebus once more. First, there's the matter of visual representation. The similarity of the two reproductions when placed side by side is quite striking. Sure, the modern image below may be sharper as a result of advances in photographic technology, yet the composition of both images is virtually indistinguishable. Their near identical presentation in both catalogues suggests that techniques for capturing and presenting visual likenesses of objects to complement written documentation frameworks have remained largely constant at the armouries since Fawkes's day. The classificatory systems used to organise the characteristics of King Henry's breechloader in the inventory and survey and the armoury's online database are also remarkably alike. Both outline the object's title, accession number, date, dimensions, historical provenance, physical description, calibre, manufacturing information, maker's mark, and bibliographic references. The digital record certainly conveys greater detail in many of these categories, although this reflects as much the relative merits of printed and digital formats as developments in documentation practice. One would perhaps assume that two classificatory frameworks produced a century apart would differ more substantially. When framed in terms of the benefits of institutional continuity, however, this similarity becomes much more comprehensible. Why bother undertaking a laborious overhaul of documentation standards if they've already been established on a sound footing? As such, it's made practical sense for the armouries to retain Fawkes's comprehensive framework, generally remaining content to update and revise the information within it without fundamentally altering its structure. In short, the Royal Armouries modern collections database in its current form largely owes its very existence to the inventory of the survey. So what are the conclusions I've drawn from my investigation of Charles Fawkes's inventory and survey of the armouries of the Tower of London? Firstly, that the early 20th century marked a period of intellectual interest in arms and armour, with Fawkes's exhaustive catalogue of the Tower Armouries holdings representing a key contribution to the field. Detailed study of weapons collections was aided by networks of specialists, at this stage associated with, but not solely confined to professional institutions like the armouries. This emerging community was in part characterised by its strong commitment to historical accuracy, one that was clearly manifested by Dillon and Fawkes, repudiating the earlier focus on the visual spectacle of arms and armour. There was also an assumption that this important scholarly work was best left to the experts. The inventory and survey adopted a didactic tone where it addressed a wider public at all. Conversely, Fawkes championed more progressive documentation practices, reflected by the implementation of fixed accession numbers, and thorough recording standards at the armories. Indeed, the innovations pioneered by Dillon and then Fawkes laid the foundations for the institution's modern management of its arms and armour collections, and are still discernible today in its online collections database. Lastly, this research has strengthened my conviction that contemporary museums are inescapably bound up with their histories, so it's necessary to study an institution's past to better understand its current behaviour. Just as Fawkes acknowledged that his endeavours relied upon the compilation and collation of the past work of others, so might modern managers of weapons collections gain fresh insight into their own practice by revisiting the efforts of their predecessors. Thank you very much. And just as an aside at the end, most of the sources that I've consulted are available on the Armouries website within their collections pages. So if you do have any more, want to look further into these, go on the Armouries website, or if you want, I can post the links directly as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was fascinating as well. And I think it's really interesting seeing these two papers together, because they both emphasize two sides perhaps of the same coin about collections, and the fact that people lie behind collections, either through the people like Spence, who actually are physically gathering items, or Fawkes, who are trying to make sense out of the chaos of a massive collection. And so what we have today really is the result of human action. And I think that's quite interesting and important. But it's not for me to witter on. I have some questions that people, and you can continue adding questions into the Q&A box as well. But I'll start off with the ones I've got. So I'll start with Chris and Phil. Let's Stuart relax for a second. Oh gosh, questions are popping in quick and fast. Right, so for Chris and Phil, the first question, which is one I was going to ask if no one else did, is how complete is the Spence collection? Has the collection been dispersed at any point? And have you managed to identify objects belonging to the Spence collection in other institutions or collections?
Do you want me to take this one, Phil?
Please.
Right, so basically the Spence collection, it's pretty complete in terms of it's around 2,000 pieces. He died in 1925. It was bequeathed to the Stockton Borough. Originally, he wanted a temple to Vesta building in Stockton with a bit of money. And he wanted it to be a temple to Vesta because the matchstick was invented in Stockton. And he wanted his arms and armour displayed there. And he wanted a shrine a little bit to his family. Obviously, the council was a bit like, nice idea, but we don't really have the money, time, or ability to do that. But what we'll do is we'll hold on to your collection, and hopefully one day when we've got a museum, we'll put that on display. We opened in 1953, and that's when the collection moved over from the town hall into the museum. Pretty much from that point, the collection is fairly intact. There are a few bits where there are some discrepancies, which if anybody wants any more information on that, we'd probably have to talk about that on a more one-to-one basis. His watercolours are quite interesting in that the over 100 watercolours he did of his Western Front campaign, some of them I think he gave to friends or he gave facsimiles out to other organisations, because a couple of them crop up in the DLI collection in Durham, which are different to the ones we have. Yeah, after that, it's pretty much intact.
Can I just say, to add to that, Chris, that it seems to be from the inventories and where we've tried to match objects up with the two main inventories that Spence put together, that there are one or two pieces that seem to have been moved on. Either Spence swapped them or traded them or sold them on for different pieces, better examples. I think we need to do some more work on that to establish what might have happened to these missing pieces.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I suppose the only other thing that's worth mentioning is furniture. In his ledger, we've got all his collection in terms of the ledgers matched to the weaponry, his snuff boxes, but we do not have any of his furniture, which I know isn't arms and armour based, but it's kind of that baronial hall look. I don't know what happened to that. All
right. Fascinating. That's a mystery. Another side of research to be undertaken. I've got a more specific question for you as well. I'm interested in the featuring of soldiers with edged weapons on a firearm. Is this a common theme?
In Spence's collection, I think he has two I can think of. Obviously, the one that we put into the presentation, I think there's one other that comes to mind, but we would probably, Phil can hopefully help me here. I think there are two, but again, I can probably come back, find those and get those across.
I don't know whether it's a general trend. I was quite surprised to come across the piece that we illustrated in the talk. It's a lovely piece, and I'm always suspicious that someone, in order to improve the saleability of an item in the Victorian period or early 20th century, has added an engraving just to enhance it. Because I mean, I've got limited knowledge of firearms, and although we dated that wheel-lock rifle to 1640, I wonder if it's a later piece. And I know that pikes and the use of pikes in warfare continued right through the 17th century, although they gradually went out of fashion. I was quite surprised to see that illustration on what initially I thought was a later 17th century weapon. I don't know. I'm a bit suspicious of it, but it is a lovely depiction.
Now that's an interesting point, actually, and particularly given where he was acquiring his material from. I also noticed in one of your photos he had a very extensive pewter collection mixed up with the arms and armour, which again, wearing a different hat is something of interest to me. And again, pewter is often enhanced, particularly early pewter, with wriggle work engraving to make it more saleable as well. So I think that is something to bear in mind. So I'm monitoring questions that are popping in. We have a question for, well, actually we can bring in Stuart for this one. It's for both papers. Do either Spence or Fawkes show in their descriptions of their collections the kind of assumptions about progress through history or the different levels of sophistication of different human societies that we might associate with social scientists or museum curators of around 1900? I don't know who would like to have a go at that one.
So I think in the inventory and survey particularly, the way it's organised is by the fact that it's organised based on the classification system and on the accession number. So it doesn't have that same chronological ordering or even based by like civilization that you can get in other works of the time. There was the fact that Fawkes believed that the so-called Oriental collections in the armories that were there at the beginning of the 20th century, he actually had them transferred to the British Museum. He believed they weren't really they weren't appropriate to the mission of the armories as he saw it. So along with all the specimens such as Bronze Age, Roman, other weaponry like that, they were transferred, I think 1914, 1915. So I think he primarily thought of the armories as something that that followed the progress of modern European and, well, European in general, but so he doesn't really touch upon the hierarchies of civilizations that you get through people such as Pitt Rivers and his typologies and things like that. So it's not obvious, but I think it's still there underlying.
Yeah, for Spence, he kind of, it's this book that we've got, Book M, in his collection, which where he writes his thoughts on weaponry and how it evolves. I think he mainly focuses on like kind of European civilizations moving in from like Saxons, Norman conquest, talks about kind of evolution of weaponry in that aspect, talks about Cromwell when it comes to rapiers. So he's kind of talking around that area. The only bit he talks about outside of Europe is Mexico. He's got one page on the kind of weaponry that was in that kind of area, and just how it was kind of unique. That was, I think, quite good in terms of what Spence was talking about. I don't think he was in any way trying to compare and compete or anything like that. I think he was just saying the unique nature of that, in that it had items that had feathers in and material culture that was different to the European material culture. That would pretty much be how I think Spence was writing his works, and kind of then in terms of how he has it in his ledgers is pretty much dictated through the auctioneers. I think a lot of the writings when he's writing about an object is nearly word for word that he's found in the catalogue.
Okay.
Yeah, the ledgers are also the stuff in the ledgers is according to the type of object. So there's a whole raft of armor, a whole raft of swords, which includes rapiers, hangers, the whole lot. He rarely differentiates between the different types of weapons within, edge weapons or so on. There's a section on pole arms and then snuff boxes and the rest of the stuff. It's not in any chronological order. It is just pure listings of the stuff of that type in his collection.
Fascinating. But the sort of tail end of the principle of the cabinet of curiosity, it's more the collection as a group that matters rather than sort of the more modern typological sort of differentiations we might think. I've got another question about collections, which I think is primarily for Chris and Phil, but also may well be relevant to Stuart, is what do you have any thoughts on the collections in private hands, or that exist, albeit not those as large as Spence? And I think what this question means is, what is their potential in the study of private collections more generally? Obviously, Spence's is now public, but there are large collections, I imagine, out there. I mean, should we be thinking about how we can engage with private collections more and that sort of thing? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it would be a good thing in terms of if there are private collectors out there that can somehow network with public museums and their collections. There's opportunities there to do loans in terms of from the private collections. I think in the English Civil War exhibition, it wasn't so much a weapon, but I think we either loaned the rights or we were going to loan a painting of one of the commanders in the Scarborough area. And that kind of came through like kind of networking, connecting in with people. So that's probably important. There is probably, in terms of concern with elements to do with the art market, in terms of private collections, and obviously they're not for public benefit, they're in the private collection, and sometimes they can then just leave the public's ability to even be able to disseminate them. If they go abroad, then potentially it might be that they're in such a niche collection that won't be known about. So yeah, it's an interesting field. And in terms of public engagement, I think it's positive if we can network and if there was that ability to talk to private collectors, because they can learn things from us, we can learn things from them. Archive, I'm big on archive. Sometimes just the right bit of information can unlock a whole new story about an object as well.
If I can add to that, sorry, Stuart. If I can add to that, Chris, there are two elements I feel would be appropriate in informing us with regard to the Spence collection. One is we want to start looking at other similar collectors of the period, around the period. People like Timperley, whose collection is now in the York Castle Museum, the big collection that is now looked after in the Great North Museum in Newcastle upon Tyne. We want to look at those individuals. We want to know more about those individuals, what influenced their collecting activities. It may give us some idea on why Spence collected what he did and when he did, and so on. And the second one is contemporary collectors of arms and armour. It would be great to hear from them, because as Chris says, they've got great specialisms, great collections, which we could draw on and make comparisons with. And more, I personally, I'm looking more at stuff that's coming up in sale rooms through the specialist dealers particularly, because a lot of information, which I lack because I'm not a specialist, a lot of information is coming through auction catalogues and little specialist catalogues that auctioneers and dealers are providing. They're a wealth of information, and we should embrace them. We should work closely with them.
Yeah, and sorry, just one last bit that I was going to put to that as well is we are working towards designation for the Spence Collection. So that is something that, again, anybody can support us in that activity, then brilliant, because it would be fantastic to see that the Arts Council acknowledge the Spence Collection as a bit of a unique gem in the country. In terms of obviously national collections, they're there, but in terms of a local authority museum, which is what we are, I think it's the kind of thing that needs protecting.
Yeah, and going back to the question and picking up on Chris's earlier point about networks, I think from a historical view as well, with a view to historical study, it's very interesting and I'd say quite important to recognise that the private collectors and established institutions like museums weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a much broader field that were interacting with each other. They were sharing information with each other, and often transferring collections in between each other. So I think taking that networked perspective and seeing how arms and armour circulated at the time is a very fruitful way of doing it and can bring up some quite interesting findings. And just on that point, am I all right to ask a question to Phil and Chris? So I was just wondering, did Spence have any interactions with any of the major museums you know of, or was he mainly just in London for the showrooms and the sales and the auctioneers?
I think, well, you mentioned Laking. I know he's got a copy of that in his archive. So I know that he's familiar with that element because of his archive. He was in London, like you say, Liberty of London. That was an interesting one. They would send him pen and ink sketches of rapiers. And we've got one in the collection, one of the rapiers he picked up by Liberty. And then Liberty themselves, when I contacted them, didn't even know that they used to sell that kind of thing. So that was quite fun. But in terms of the museum side, other than Laking, I don't know how much engagement he had with museums beyond that.
I can't remember any references to cross-referencing anything in a museum collection in his ledgers. I don't think he had that association with them at all.
Fantastic. Well, I've got a specific comment and question for Stuart now. We have a comment to begin with, and it's basically you've given a welcome assessment of Fawkes's contribution as curator and later master. A comment rather than a question. You said Fawkes's inventory numbers were permanent. This is largely true, but inventory numbers of some objects disposed of at auction sales in the late 60s and early 70s were reused for new acquisitions, an incredibly confusing practice. Fortunately ended by AVB Norman when he was appointed Master of the Armouries in 1977. So
fair enough. There are people in this call who do know the Armouries collections a fair bit less than I do. So thank you for the correction. But I'd say the fundamental point still stands that his documentation frameworks and his accession numbers have largely survived to this day and are still really important in the work of the Armouries. But thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, and this is a problem across all museums of all kinds as well. Multiple use of the same accession number has plagued my career in the past as well. I have another question for Stuart. Do the two pictures of the Henry VIII gun suggest that one part has been removed, and does that suggest a change in display practice? Oh, somebody's had another question, so I just lost the other one. Anyway, does that suggest a change in display practice between the two?
So I believe the change is the hinged breech of the gun is on one of them it's open, on one of them it's shut. So I think that perhaps might speak to different practices of conservation and management, because I know for the fact that when managing weapons collections, you're trying not to disturb moving parts these days as little as possible, because obviously this might produce excess wear, and trying to keep it in as better condition as possible. So it might reflect that, but I think in general it's more of a conservation and management thing perhaps than a display thing, but that's just my interpretation of it, so might be the case.
Okay. Actually, I was going to ask a question of my own that was kind of related to the disposal that was kind of hinted at in one of the earlier questions. Is what happened when you said material was disposed? I mean, was it all sold at auction? Was it physically thrown away, or is this material still out there that we can identify?
So is this the Oriental collections and?
Well, no, things like sort of the fakes is the wrong
right
word.
Okay, so they are still in the collection. It's just that they weren't included in the inventory and survey, so I think he just treated them with a bit of contempt, and he wasn't interested in what fakes and forgeries could suggest about the development of collecting practices and things like that. I think in his eyes they were just they were a mistake that had been let into the collection by lax management practices, and that he could tolerate them, but they wouldn't have a place in the alongside the actual historical objects within the collections.
Oh, right. Sorry. So they weren't skipped, is basically.
No. And from what I gather, most of them are still in the collection today, fortunately.
And also a fascinating topic in their own right, I would have thought as well. But we still have some time for more questions if anyone wants to pop them in the Q&A box. I've got one that I'm kind of saving for the end because it's kind of a slightly more general question. But if anyone else has a specific question on either of the two papers, you can pop it in now, or forever hold your peace. Well, I'll ask the slightly more general question I've been given. We have a question here from somebody who says, I have been looking a while now to become a curator in arms and armories, and basically wanting advice or tips for the steps and courses to take. So what would your advice be to somebody who's thinking of becoming a curator in this area, and how should they go about achieving it?
So I can talk about my own experience in that, obviously, yeah, volunteering is really important. If you can get into a museum and do some volunteering work in the collection. Museum studies courses are really very good. The one at Tyne-Wear Archives and Museums is very good. Sunderland curating degrees where I went to, and that was fantastic. That was on more about like a more general curation. And then I did a course with Staffordshire University and the Royal Armouries combined, which was on firearms. That was a little bit to do with the forensics, so I didn't do the third day on that, but amazing course. So if ever that's running again, strong recommend. And then once I was within the museums, I was looking for whatever courses there were, and the British Museum and its partnership project was fantastic. Went to Durham Oriental. A guy called Simon Prentice was there, who was their Japanese swords guy, and he taught us on Japanese swords for the day. So I mean, and he's been a really good contact afterwards, and we've learned more from him as we've gone on. So that's kind of experiences. I feel like if you're looking and the opportunities are there, then hopefully anybody can follow that kind of path and get into the opportunities where they come up.
Fantastic. Do Phil or Stuart have any?
Mostly echoing what Chris has said, really. Again, building up that experience through whatever opportunities you can get. And again, I also did a museum studies course as well, which seems to be standard practice these days, to be able to have the unique, like you really need to have the masters in order to be considered, unfortunately. But it does open up opportunities. I did my course at Leeds and was able to do a placement at the Armouries, so that's where I first got into arms and armour specifically. But the way I went about it is that I was looking at museums more generally, and then the particular PhD opportunity came up, and that is the collaborative with between the University of Leeds and the Royal Armouries. So there's a practical element within that. So I think my advice is maybe take it more generally and build up the skills. But if there are any opportunities that come up in your specific area, then try and jump on them if you can. I think, yeah, it's a tricky one, but keep pushing and you'll get there.
Yeah, I'm afraid my experience is that you're asking the wrong person here, because 45, nearly 50 years ago, I was a failed applicant for an assistant curator job in the Royal Armouries when I was doing my O-levels. I never applied again for an arms and armour job, but I did persevere to get a job in museums. It's what I passionately always wanted to do. And as Chris says, and Stuart says, you've got to put in the work, you've got to get the academic background, do the museum studies courses, which there are various ones. In my day, there were only basically 2 at Manchester and Leicester, but there are many more these days. Very often you need some kind of specialist PhD or whatever in your field as well. It's very demanding on academic qualifications these days. And voluntary work. Although I gave up on going into arms and armour, one of the first voluntary jobs I did at Leicester Museums was to recatalogue and audit the whole of the regimental museum of the Leicestershire Regiment in Leicester. So, stick at it, folks. It's a long slog, but you'll get there if you're determined.
Fantastic. Lots of useful advice, and for any kind of curation, yes, stick at it. It's usually very good advice. I've got a couple of general questions. So I'll ask the first one is, do the panel have any thoughts on the improvement, in inverted commas, of exhibits or alteration for display, for example, deactivation of licensable items?
I think if it's a museum object that's been like, Section 5 and it's within your collection, I don't know that should change. I think that should be kept as is. In terms of trying to get hands-on with an object, I guess if it's deactivated, even then you wouldn't be able to get hands-on with it actually, because there's certain legislation behind that. I think you'd have to fill out a bit of paperwork, to still get your hands on that. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think trying to make a good display where the interpretation tells the story, you can get hands-on with the object in the best way possible. If it's through a replica, that's usually, I think, probably a good way of going about it, and having the real object there preserved. So it's for this generation and the next generation. I think there's a few principles that I think will last over time.
Yep. I was going to ask you a question about risk assessment, but I won't, which I imagine you fill out considerable risk assessments.
Yeah.
The kind of collections you have. Okay. I've got another one that's just come in. I'm saving the last question for the end because I think there's a very good question for the end. Do you have any, this is a very big question, I think. Do you have any standard techniques for testing for authenticity of older arms and armour? How do you know whether they're genuine?
That's a good one for you, Chris, with your recent find of your Viking helmet, surely.
Yeah, that's a nice one to come in with. So yeah, we have the only intact Viking helmet in the British Isles, one of only 2 in the world. We were able to announce that this year, thankfully, because we did a lot of work with Durham University. Durham University academics were amazing. They had it for a few years. It took a while to be able to come across the Viking helmet and say that was authentic by doing all sorts of lab analysis, looking at the metal, looking at that kind of gem kind of analysis within the metal, the kind of scoriation of it and things like that. So yeah, that one was easy for us to say it's authentic because Durham University then turned around and go, it's authentic. So, or very, very, very likely to be. I don't want to overplay or underplay it. I'll try and get that right, otherwise somebody's going to shoot me. So yeah, that's a good one. And I think from the time me and Phil have been cataloguing a lot of Spence's arms and armour, sometimes it's just the feel and the very kind of it's the feel and weight of it. Sometimes you get these really tinny bits of armour that just don't seem to be consistent with the other pieces you had. You can sometimes see those inconsistencies. So that sometimes helps having a kind of a broad base of a collection, which is hopefully authentic. You can see the outliers and sometimes tell that and go, this doesn't look quite right, or that maker's mark isn't the same as what you'd normally see. A good one is swords, I guess. There's always it's a bit like people having fake designer clothing. You would have fake stamps on swords. So, but I think that's part of the story of that sword anyway, and how people were trying to get that across as an authentic or a very worthy sword. Solingen and all those kind of makers' marks would crop up quite often.
Yeah. Conversely, what I would add to that, Chris, is I've handled lots of replica weapons, and when you compare the weight of, say, a rapier or a backsword to a modern reenactor's replica weapon, the swords are remarkably light and fine. It's very, very surprising. You would think they'd be too flimsy, would break and crack so easily because they are so light compared with a modern replica weapon. That's very surprising.
Fantastic. Well, it's good to hear about the Yarm. You didn't plug it. It's the Yarm helmet.
Yeah.
And you can tell it's Viking, it's got horns on, but I'm kidding, that was a joke. Right, I've got one final question which I think is a super question, and it applies to all of you. If you could ask Spence or Fawkes each a question about their collections that would help you with your work today, what would that be? What would you really want to ask them? Well, so should we start with Spence?
Yeah, I think I would probably ask him a certain element on his collection, and it would probably go into the background of the man himself as well. He's got a kind of religious kind of bent to him in his personality, and like from what I can glean from his readings, and he talks about warrior monks and guys going out in 1066 and not drawing blood with swords, and they use maces instead. So I would be interested in that from my own personal studies, my own personal research and interests. I would just ask him, what role did he think religion perhaps played in his collecting, his life, and war, which obviously sometimes people don't like mixing those two things together, but it's very much it did happen.
Yeah, I'd probably ask him why he didn't uniquely number everything to make life easy for us.
Good point. Stuart, what would you ask Fawkes?
I think like a general question is, how on earth did he manage to oversee both the armories and the Imperial War Museum at the same time? Like today that would be impossible, but somehow he managed to combine them both. But I think towards the collection specifically, I'd quiz him on why did he get rid of the specifically the Oriental collections, but also some of the other collections. And I'd like to find the nitty-gritty about that and his reasons for doing so, because he does say that it's less relevant to the interests of the armories, but I'd like to quiz him further on those decisions, especially in light of the fact that a lot of the certainly the Asian collections have since returned to the armories and were recatalogued in a different place. So quite an interesting rabbit hole, I think.
Good questions from all our speakers. Well, I think we've had some really interesting questions there and some really interesting answers. And I think I'll draw it to a close now. I think, we've seen fascinating insights into sort of two really important historic collections and the way that we now are managing them today. and thinking about them, and I've certainly learnt a lot. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Chris Young, Phil Philo and Stuart Fose, for fascinating insight. To remind you that the conference continues on this afternoon, when the next panel will be on arms and armour as social, I've forgotten what it is now. Anyway, there's another session this afternoon as well, so do please come back for that. In the meantime, thank you for all attending and for posing your questions as well. That makes a big difference and certainly makes my job of chairing a lot easier as well, so I don't have to come up with lots of things I don't know very much about. But thank you once again to all our speakers, and it's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you this afternoon.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.